Welcome to Dialogues in Afro-Latinidad, a podcast dedicated to amplifying and elevating Afro-Latinx histories, cultures, and communities across the Americas and beyond. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Vasquez. Join us for conversations with experts and artists to learn more about Afro-Latinidad. Venga. My guest today is Professor Gladys Mitchell-Walthour. She is professor and Dan T. Blue Endowed Chair of Political Science at North Carolina Central University. She studies Afro-Brazilian political behavior, race, gender, and social policies in Brazil. And in 2023, she published The Politics of Survival, the Political Opinions of Social Welfare Beneficiaries in Brazil and the USA. She is also co-editor of Black Lives Matter in Latin America, published in 2024. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and a BA from Duke University. Thank you so much for joining me today, Professor. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Professor Reed Vasquez, for the invitation. I'm so excited.
So let's jump right in. So I know that you grew up in North Carolina, Kannapolis, if I'm getting that right, just outside of Charlotte.
Yes.
And now you're this endowed chair, scholar of Afro-Brazilian political behavior, race, gender, and policy. So how did this all start? How did you become interested in looking at these communities in Afro-Latin America?
That is a great question. So the town I'm from, I think it's a little bit bigger now, but when I was growing up, I want to say it was maybe 60,000. So very small, very white. It's, more diverse now, but still very white, but still white. And so when I was in high school from about 1992 to 1996, the trend at that time and even into the 2000s was that there was a huge increase in Mexicans in the state of North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And in places like Winston-Salem and Concord, North Carolina. Concord actually borders the city where I grew up. But there was a huge increase in Afro-Mexicans. And so we just started seeing, lots of Black Mexicans. And I just remember one time with some neighbors, because our former neighbors had moved, sold their house. And then, this new family moved in. And I remember talking one time, and I had mentioned something about them being, Black Mexicans, and they just cracked up. They were just like, what? And so then they started making jokes with each other. And of course, at the time, I was a high school student. I wasn't studying, race in Latin America. And so I just found it super interesting. We would have conversations with them. We met some of their other friends and things like that. And, but I did, so that kind of like laid the seed to me to know, there are people from other countries, from Latin America, who are my color, darker. I mean, because some of them, they were even darker. I have a twin, and we met some of their, family members. No, these were some other Afro-Latin Americans that we met, actually Afro-Mexicans that we met. And they ended up having twins in their family. And the twins were even darker than us, but it was the same thing. Like nobody said they were Black Mexicans or Afro-Mexicans. And so that was just interesting to me. Mm-hmm. And so then fast forward, I went to Duke for undergrad. And I double majored in political science and African and African American studies. Mm-hmm. And so in African and African American studies, I took a history class. It was in, the department. And it was taught by Dr. John French. And the class was on Afro-Brazilian history and culture. Mm-hmm. So before I was already, interested in Latin America. But after that class, I just knew, I think I took it in my second year, and I knew, okay, I'm doing something on Brazil. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Had no idea what it was going to be, but I knew I would do something on Brazil. And it was just super interesting to me because we were learning everything about religion, of course, history, the history of enslavement, um, also learning about, how Afro-Brazilians mobilized. So I remember we read a book about Benedita da Silva, who's now a congressperson, but started
Mhm.
off as like a city councilwoman and activist in her neighborhood. And so all of those experiences led me to want to do some, type of work
Mhm.
focused on Afro descendants in Brazil.
Okay. So it's first in and around the hometown, curiosity, then you take this course. Were there any particular moments, maybe it's in the course, but I'm just thinking about um some other defining moments of that journey. Maybe it was after the course, maybe it was in grad school, maybe it was just meeting people when you were in Brazil.
Yes, yeah. So I would definitely say defining moments. Um, so that was kind of how I got interested, in the study. Um, But then the defining moments were definitely the experiences that I had in Brazil, and then also talking with other scholars. And then later, I would say, having the opportunity to actually interact with Black activists in Brazil.
Mhm.
So I eventually, decided I wanted to do, well, I knew I wanted to do graduate school, but at first I was thinking law school.
Mhm.
Um, but I knew I wanted to do something also with like basically empowering Black communities.
Mhm.
But I had two really great professors in political science who really kept encouraging me to do a PhD. And as a young person, like, I don't know, 20, 21-year old, I wasn't really thinking about a PhD, but I
Mhm.
knew I loved to write and I knew I loved reading.
Mhm.
Um, and so what I actually ended up doing was going to Michigan for a public policy degree, a master's. But I still had this thought of like, I want to do something in Brazil. And after, studying economic policies and international policy, um, I noticed a lot of the policy recommendations came from, kind of doing these economic analysis, but not really from survey work or like talking with people.
Right. Right.
And so that's when I knew, okay, let me get the PhD. And so when I started doing field work, that is when I had, more of the on the ground experience where you're actually observing, interacting with people.
Mhm.
Um, and then, as a Black person, that means I'm in another country, but I'm also, if I'm not speaking, right, I'm
Right.
also experiencing what other people experience every day, right?
Exactly.
So even in cities like Salvador,
Mhm.
which is where my work started, which is in the Northeast, it's 80% Afro-Brazilian,
Mhm.
but I experienced racism.
Mhm.
Um, and so it was always so interesting to me when, and this, most of the time when I go to Brazil, I'm interacting with Black Brazilians.
Mhm.
And so, but Black Brazilians would ask, oh, yeah, have you experienced racism here? I'm like, yes, of course.
Haven't you? I mean,
Yeah. But I think that a lot of people assume that as an American, there are certain
mhm.
privileges that you may get, and sometimes, yeah, sometimes you will get some privileges. But again, there are a lot of assumptions made just going off of color,
Mhm.
which then I won't say allows, but leads to
Yeah.
having some similar experiences.
Mhm.
And so having those experiences as well as already kind of knowing what was going on really helped to push my work in terms of knowing that it was a place that I wanted to study, but also later in my career, knowing that it was also a place where I could just see all of this powerful work that Black
Mhm.
Brazilians were doing, especially Black Brazilian women, to
Mhm.
combat all of this, right? The
Yeah.
racism, the sexism, homophobia, in all aspects, right? So just kind of grassroots mobilization, but also everyday ways of resistance, like young people wearing their hair natural.
Yeah.
even in a city that's, mainly Black, that's still an act of resistance, right?
Right.
And people embracing Blackness. So I wanted to, of course, like interact with people, but also to bring it to the academy to be like, okay, like we political scientists, we do actually need to pay attention to this. It's not only, oh yeah, so what are your, people who hold these racial attitudes, this is, how, this is why they support certain policies. But it's also things like, oh, well, if there's a person who has this skin tone, this hair type,
Mm-hmm.
they probably have certain experiences that then lead them to support progressive racial policies.
Mm-hmm.
And you see more of that in political science. Of course, you always see it in sociology, but and anthropology, where they kind of go beyond just the everyday demographics.
Mm-hmm.
And so in my scholarly work, I wanted to make sure we were actually paying attention to what kind of these everyday acts of resistance that's
Yes.
hard to capture in a survey.
Yeah.
Um, and then, like I kind of later in my career, I had more opportunities to actually, um, kind of support the work that activists are doing in Brazil. So I know that was a long answer, but
No, no, I think it's a perfect segue, in fact, to my next question, which is, what you're really passionate about, this creating these dialogues between Black activists in Brazil with scholars and practitioners and activists in the U.S. So, say a little bit more about what drew you to that. I mean, you nodded to it with kind of the questions that you asked and your conversations, but what else? How did this become really and a driving force? And I'll just say, I got a chance to see the screening of your latest documentary, and I was just kind of blown away. And that because that really seems to represent that passion that you have for connecting these communities.
yes, yes. And thank you for coming to the screening. um, so yeah, I think it really happened. So in 2018, that is when, well, even before then, right, there was what some people call um, a coup, right, or an impeachment, others, when Dilma Rousseff was forced out of office. So that was going on in Brazil, but then, so it was already getting, and of course, Brazil already has a history of authoritarianism, but you were seeing more of that. And so eventually, so she was impeached, and then her VP, who was from a more conservative party, took over. And then after that, Bolsonaro was elected.
Mhm.
And so there was just so much activism in Brazil to try to prevent that, right? Because
Mhm.
his opponent, Haddad, Fernando Haddad, ran for office from the Workers' Party. So people were mobilizing. Um, Unfortunately, Bolsonaro won. And so from the U.S. side, among scholars and activists, people were also trying to figure out, well, how can we support this
Mhm.
work that they are already doing,
Right.
right? So it wasn't like a new project, like, oh, what can we do? It was more of
Mhm.
like, how can we support what they are doing? And so Dr. Jim Green, who he retired, but he was a historian at Brown University, he created the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. And so I was a part of that, and then later became the co-director with him. And so it was just a lot of, also, of course, later there was the pandemic. So a lot of this was exactly what we are doing,
Mhm.
talking with people, but across continents, right?
Mhm.
And figuring out, how we could support what people were doing. Um, and so that really gave me more the opportunity to go beyond just my, writing articles and writing books, which of course are important, but it actually put me in more contact with actually speaking with activists.
Mhm.
And for me, of course, I was very interested in speaking with Black activists from Brazil. So I would say around 2018, 2019 is when I just had more of those opportunities.
Mhm.
And so We were having meetings. Some of the things that we did on the US side was trying to pressure, well, and we did pressure Congress people, US Congress people, to make statements against what was going on in Brazil. And so a lot of, even though I'm a political scientist, that's not work that I do every day, like to call a congressperson. And so a lot of us didn't, and we were from all kind of fields, including like Brazilian, American activists. It's just like, it wasn't something that we knew how to do. So we were having trainings on, well, how do you actually effectively kind of communicate with the staff? And then also, how do we mobilize to get this person to respond, right? So sometimes, well, so we had these trainings, and since we were throughout the U.S., we were trying to contact our Congress person. And so that was some of the stuff that I was able to do on the U.S. side. I eventually, with Dr. Sherelle Barber, we did a briefing in Washington, D.C., because she also had has this fantastic documentary about Marielle Franco. She was actually at that last meeting before Marielle Franco was assassinated. Wow. So she had already been showing her film, and then she showed the film in DC. And then I had kind of like a policy type memo, just letting people know. So we were briefing the staff members of Congress people. Again, all of these efforts to try to get them to speak out. And it was a successful effort, because they were speaking out, just letting people know what's going on, but also letting Brazilians know, right, that people in the U.S., Congress people were aware, and did not support, authoritarianism. So for me, that was really kind of a defining moment. But also it really helped me to kind of practice what I had already been studying.
Right.
And then I would also just add on to that. So that was when I was still in Wisconsin at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, but I moved to North Carolina in 2022. And of course, this whole time, well, not during the pandemic, but, I was still traveling back and forth to Brazil. So I was still, doing research and still, talking with people. But then once I moved to North Carolina with the endowment that I had, one of my main goals was, how can I use, this pot of money beyond just, research, which again is important. But how can I use it to continue supporting the work of Black Brazilian activists and scholars? And so that's pretty much what I've been doing, by inviting people, to come to Durham, and they're not just giving a presentation. And all of these are open. So sometimes you'll see graduate students, professors, from Duke, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. One time there was someone who came from Greensboro, but it includes both activists and, just local activists or just people interested. And so, of course, we kind of have those dialogues, but then I set up these other opportunities, whether that's a lunch or a dinner, where they're actually just speaking with people, right? So it's not it's not so formal. And then, of course, I also set up meetings with people, either in Durham or, the local community, so that they are actually, again, speaking with community leaders, and again, building just these connections and partnerships and having dialogues that I think is so important for, Black people, again, across countries, continents to have.
No, I mean, no, I'm just thinking about how hard it is. I think being a scholar, sometimes we feel somewhat removed from that grassroots on the ground piece of it, and it really is important to have both positions, so that because those perspectives can really impact how people can, how they move forward, how they understand what the conditions are, why things are happening the way that they're happening. Um, and so I'm curious also about the work in this, because it's clearly very transnational, and this kind of links between the U.S. and Latin America. And so, what do you think? Doing this, having that kind of transnational focus, what do you think it contributes to helping us understand about Afro-Brazilian communities, and specifically, but kind of Afro-Latin American communities, more both here and in the U.S.?
Yes, that's great. The other thing I just wanted to add um, was that I think when we have, I mean, so clearly the work of activists is producing knowledge,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And even having activists to give a presentation, that's also knowledge production.
Yes.
I think oftentimes in the academy, just with the measures we have, so our measures tend to be things like publications
Uh-huh.
and things like that, whether it's a book or a journal. And so then it's very difficult to kind of, to acknowledge that it's knowledge production. So that's just one
Yeah.
thing that I wanted to say.
Mhm.
Now, the other thing in terms of, I find it so important,
Mhm.
right, for Black Americans, and I'm sure you experience this too in the classroom. Um, you know, just like I was saying when I was an undergrad, there were things I didn't know, right? And
Mhm.
so I think especially now that I'm located at an HBCU, and there's already a lot of diversity there in terms of you have students from you know, from the Caribbean, you have
Mhm.
students from different African countries, you have students from very different class levels.
Mhm.
Um, so that's just some of the diversity that I think people don't see, but that they already have
Yeah.
at HBCUs.
Mhm.
But even with that diversity, and then of course there are also Latino students, Latinx students. Um, but still, I every semester, right? I have students who they're like, I never knew there were Black people in Latin America.
Yep.
And so, so that's where we are starting,
Mhm.
right? So first, they need to know people exist,
Right.
and then from there, they find it fascinating, right? When we start talking about history,
Mhm.
when we start talking about mobilization,
Mhm.
and then when we start talking about things, how even through hip hop, right,
Mhm.
in Latin America,
Yeah.
how people were able to use symbols from the US to empower their own communities, right, and
Exactly.
to make their own form of hip hop. And so
Exactly.
things like that, that's, just like in the classroom. But even for, just the very diverse Black community, I think it's
Mhm.
also important, right, for people to also know that, oh, there are some things that we share in common.
Mhm.
There, and of course, people, of course, we all know there are differences, right, because of history and
Right.
things like that. But I do think it's important. And I think for everyday Black Americans, um, for scholars, for leaders to not be so US centric.
Mhm.
And I still find that in a lot of universities, not necessarily in Black studies departments, because those tend to be global
Mhm.
anyway, just in terms of, the focus. But if you look in fields like mine, like in political science, right? Um, Sociology and anthropology, they've done a better job. But oftentimes in political science, if people are talking about race and politics, and they're talking about Black people, it's usually U.S.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm like, but there are so many Black people throughout the world.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, and so I think it's really important. And some examples I give to to people in general, I'm like, okay, if we think about something like police violence against Black people, there's no way you can leave out Brazil.
Right.
I mean, just the sheer numbers. The numbers in the U.S. are, just much lower than the ones in Brazil, right? And it's a horrible
Yeah.
situation anywhere that this takes place in the world. But if we have a true commitment to challenging police brutality against Black people, you have to talk about Latin America, and you have to talk about Brazil. There's no way you can. So that's just one example of why I think it's so important for Black people located in the U.S., right, to know about what's going on in other countries such as Latin America.
Yeah. So that leads me right into my next question, talking about kind of urgent issues in Latin America for Afro-Latin Americans in particular. In addition, let's say in addition to uh, the police violence, what other urgent issues do you think are important, especially for African Americans to know and to be aware, or Americans more broadly to be more aware about?
Yeah. Well, one would definitely, well, and of course, as a political scientist, I'm going to say political representation,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Um, because it's just, and actually, the moment we are living in,
Oh yes.
speaking of authoritarianism, um, I think it's important because there are just so many rollbacks here.
Hmm.
Whereas in the past, so there's always, been significant underrepresentation of Afro-Brazilians, for example, in Congress, right?
Yes.
And so the interesting thing, right, was, when people compared, they would say, well, but in the US, Black Americans are only whatever, 12 or 13% of the population. But, look at how they were able to elect, Black politicians.
Hmm.
However, now that's been challenge for us, right? And that's just one, I mean, we could also talk about other areas, such as employment and things like that that's been
Yep.
rolled back for Black Americans. So the interesting thing in terms of kind of urgent issues is
Hmm.
I would definitely say political mobilization, of course, education.
Hmm.
But I also think there's a lot we can learn from Latin America,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about, you'll have to excuse me for talking about Brazil so much,
No, this is why
but
you're here. This is your area of specialty. Talk about
but Brazil and Colombia both, and even some other Latin American countries, are trying to do more in terms of making sure that their curriculum includes Afro descendants,
it.
right? But in Brazil in 2003, legislation was passed that all schools have to teach African and Afro-Brazilian history, right? And then when we look at the attacks on kind of education in the
Hmm.
US,
Yep.
there's a lot we can learn, right? Because
Hmm.
they already had that implemented. And then even when we look at, universities in the US,
Hmm.
they're also being attacked, like,
Yeah.
um, in so many horrific ways. And, but, so I think part of it is that we've fought for a lot here. And
Hmm.
so so people were kind of comfortable with what we have, right?
Hmm.
And still fighting for things. And here I'm just, talking about education, but like, who would expect for what is happening now
Hmm.
to happen so fast, right? I
Yeah.
think Black people were already at the forefront of knowing, that this country wasn't what it always promoted itself as. But I think just
Certainly.
the speed is
Hmm.
um, is very
Unprecedented.
troubling,
Yeah.
and I think so things like that we can learn from. I also just think about just the amazing mobilization that I see from Black Brazilian women. So they just had their
Yeah.
uh, anniversary, like 10-year anniversary of the first Black Women's March. So they
Hmm.
had a second one in Brasilia where over 300,000 Black women gathered.
Wow.
Um, and um, but so they're fighting things like femicide against
Hmm.
Black women. They're also trying to increase Black women in political office,
Hmm.
right? And it's still difficult, but the numbers are increasing in terms of candidates, right? It's
Right.
still it's slowly increasing for those who actually win,
Yeah.
but you do need people to actually run.
Right.
And what they've done is just create so many supports that aren't necessarily um, financial in terms of groups, right? So other Black women's organizations supporting Black women across the country,
Right.
right? Whether that's through social media, that type of exposure.
Hmm.
So I think kind of like those kind of efforts are things that we can learn from, but also just
Hmm.
in terms of those very important issues. Of course, it's always, education. Like I mentioned, femicide, including the dangers or how dangerous it is for Black women to run for office. It's
Mm.
extremely
Yeah.
dangerous, right?
Yeah.
So that's a barrier, again, that as a political scientist, if I'm just looking at numbers
Hmm.
or even resources, it might be something I would miss if I
Right.
don't know the context.
Hmm.
And then, there are the other issues that unfortunately are similar across the diaspora. So we mentioned, police violence,
Mm.
things like that. Of course, similar trends in terms
Hmm.
of unemployment.
Hmm.
They have some good news from Brazil in that I don't remember the percentage, but so for a lot of the women receiving Bolsa Familia, which is their kind of a program to where the family gets a card that they can use to purchase food every month,
Okay.
like kind of like a monthly stipend,
Hmm.
or the similar to SNAP, but not exactly, but similar,
Okay.
right? And so a lot of those women though were able to actually come off of the program because of social mobility,
Ah,
right?
okay.
So that's amazing, and again just shows the work of President Lula is now in office,
Hmm.
um, and so those type of things like social mobility
Hmm.
um, is something that that you can see, and I think so issues like unemployment, poverty are still very important issues, but it's nice when you can get some good
Yeah.
news. But those are the kind of some of the issues that are still very much at the forefront. Again, women's health, and again, like I said, similar trends, unfortunately, where Black women, um, are those more likely to die giving birth
Hmm.
compared to other groups. And it's a similar trend here, and even in other Latin American countries. So those are some of the kind of pertinent issues, I would say, in Brazil, but Latin America in general.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just keep thinking about how there's so still urgent issues here, and so that's and as you say in the kind of diasporic world, those are all very kind of common issues that people are continuing to organize and mobilize around. Well,
Yes.
we only have we're coming up on the end of our time, unfortunately. But I wanted to just get a sense of other kind of resources besides what I mentioned in your introduction. But what other kind of resources would you recommend to people who are interested in learning more about Afro Brazilians in general, Afro Brazilian politics, race and gender? What would you suggest that they see or read or listen to or any of those areas?
Yes. So, of course, there are lots of resources in Portuguese,
Hmm.
but I'm just going to assume most people aren't speaking Portuguese. Because if they are, they probably already know the resources.
Okay.
Um, but some of the first, I'll kind of I guess I'll start with scholars that I would recommend people read would be work. And sorry to my field, political science,
Oh.
but most of them are in sociology and anthropology. So I would say work by Kristen Smith, work by Elizabeth Horch Freeman, super important. There's some great work by Bryce Henson,
Mm-hmm.
who has done some work on hip hop. Kristen Smith has just done some excellent work on mobilizing against police violence. Elizabeth Horch Freeman, she has done some work on more focused on kind of family dynamics
Okay.
in Brazil. I would also recommend Jamie Swift's work.
Mm-hmm.
I think her group is called Black Women Radicals, but it's diasporic and it's just very engaged work, right? Where she's doing all kind of things and using a bunch of different platforms. So, for example, she had a program where it was digital in the sense that where she had like a fellow from Brazil
Mm-hmm.
who they were able to do their work, but also use a digital platform to kind of disseminate that work.
Okay.
But she's also led like a march in honor of Marielle Franco in DC. So
Mm-hmm.
it's both online, but also, kind of face to face. Um, and she's a political scientist. So there we
Okay.
go.
Okay.
Now, in terms of more political opinion work, I would say, of course, some of my work, but also Andrew Janetz has some great work. JANUCZ. I might have messed that up. But he has some great work if you really just kind of want to get some empirical work.
Mm-hmm.
But the others that I listed, they are great in terms of, I think, both doing the writing, but also having action, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Horge Freeman is about to host a scholar who's going to come in. She's at Rice University, and he'll be giving lectures and and doing that type of thing. I would also say Erica Larkins,
Okay.
who's an anthropologist. Um, she has also been doing some great work in terms of bringing in activists and creating, just these dialogues. And also, she's one of the people, like, there was a horrible massacre, actually during ASWAT in Brazil,
Mm.
and an activist
Oh,
reached
yes.
out
Yes.
to,
I remember.
yes, and an activist reached out to us, and immediately we were like, okay, what are we going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Along with Dr. Kia Caldwell,
Mm-hmm.
who, again, these are the people when I think of, they're producing excellent work, focus on Brazil, but also they have the action piece,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's not just like, okay, we're going to write, we're going to do, but like, okay, this person is saying this is going on in Brazil. How can we support
Right.
this group, or how can we support moms, right,
Right.
whose relatives just got killed? Like this is
Right. Right.
very very much like practical things to do. So those are just some names.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, I probably missed some names, um, but those are people I would say check out their work, their academic work, and then also they're always doing something. So you'll be also able to see like how they are engaging
Mm-hmm.
Black activists.
Great. Thank you so much. Our plan is to have a resource page where people can access some of the resources that you mentioned. So we'll have access for that for everyone. And so I just want to thank you so much for this conversation. It's been amazing to hear your journey and the work that you're doing, especially I think for a lot of people who think of scholars as hands-off people, to see the work that you're doing with those real live contemporary connections, and the way that the diaspora is connected across the hemisphere. So thank you again so much for joining me today.
Thank you. And just one more. I also just want to thank you, Professor Reed Vasquez, because this work is so important to go beyond just writing, but to have something that's accessible.
Yes.
Again, when we think about knowledge production, like this is the action part of it, right? People can listen, right, to a podcast, right? And, you know, sometimes are more willing to do that than to pick up a book, right? So this is just super important work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So again, thank you. Appreciate all of our conversation time and look forward to more great work to come from you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and hear more episodes of Dialogues in Afro-Latinidad on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And go to michellereedvasquez.com to check out our episode resources and learn more about the Afro-Latinidad Studies Institute.